It is officially game week, but there's still some position battles that I'm interested to see how they play out. And we'll talk about those on today's episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Stay tuned.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome into another episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. Today's episode brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. It is officially game week for the Louisville football team. They will play against Georgia Tech on Friday evening down in Atlanta, so we will have a ton of coverage for this game. But before we talk about coverage for the game, I want to talk about some of the notable position battles that are still going on towards the end of camp as it relates to the depth chart that I'm interested to see how they conclude towards that first game against Georgia Tech. Obviously, something to note is that these position battles don't just stop week one. Really, they probably start to heat up a little bit with actual game reps. Some players show out, some not so much. So that's where the real test is going to be drawn, is how well these players can show out on the field. The position battles that I'm looking at specifically are wide receiver, linebacker, and tight end. Now, some of these positions are due to the influx and talent at the position. Others are the exact opposite, not having the numbers, not having the experience. But that's not the case for the wide receiver room. The wide receiver group is one that Jeff Brom went out and absolutely transformed in the offseason, right? I mean, you talk about only a handful of these receivers being back for Louisville this past year. I mean, Huggins-Bruce, Chris Bell were the only two wide receivers that made their way back to Louisville. Some graduated, others entered the transfer portal, the two scholarship wide receivers, I should say. So there are a lot of new faces entering the group, like Jamari Thrash, Kevin Coleman Jr., Jadon Thompson, Jimmy Calloway, the true freshman, Kataris Hicks, William Fowles, Jaleel McClain, so on and so forth. There's a huge amount of new players, not only on this team, but specifically at the wide receiver position. I think that this is the number one spot that I'm wondering, okay, how is Brom going to, split the snaps? I think that it's pretty obvious that wide receiver one is already defined. You know who wide receiver one is. It's Jamari Thrash. That should surprise absolutely nobody. The former Georgia State wide receiver was an all Sun Belt selection, perhaps literally the best wide receiver in the conference, had a huge season last year. He's going to be a guy that is likely going to slide into that role, sort of Tyler Hudson-esque that we, saw going from FCS to the Power 5 and still being able to contribute. I mean, he had over 1,000 yards. I think that Jamari Thrash is going to be the top guy, and that's not going to surprise anyone. It's who is backing him up and who is starting alongside him. The type of receiver that Louisville has mostly in the wide receiver room is the slot type, players that utilize speed, not necessarily so much as having the height and the verticality, but more so the explosiveness, the speed, the agility. Sub 6 foot receivers from Jackson State, Kevin Coleman Jr., rising junior Amari Huggins-Bruce. You have some other guys, true freshman Hicks, true freshman McClain. And then you have some taller receivers like Chris Bell, like Jadon Thompson. Jimmy Calloway is not the tallest receiver, but he's had a solid spring. And then you also have some other players in the mix like William Fowles, who is over 6'2" as well. So this is where you really start to wonder who is going to start at wide receiver for Louisville. And I think that, in all honesty, it is not going to matter all that much, because Braum has said it multiple times that he is going to rotate guys in to keep guys fresh all over the field, and that is definitely going to pertain to the wide receiver position. So you have essentially, on paper, 2 starting receiver spots left outside of Thrash. I think that the main battle here will be between Amari Huggins-Bruce and Kevin Coleman Jr., although I think that we're going to see them on the field together more often than not. So it might just be a formality to talk about this when you talk about the position battle there, because I do think that, with Thrash being on the outside, Kevin Coleman has shown that he can play on the outside. AHB has done the same. So I think that it's maybe not so much talking about the starters, it's talking about who's going to see the targets. I think that the 3 that we just talked about, Jamari Thrash, Kevin Coleman Jr., and Amari Huggins-Bruce, are the 3 that we are going to see with the most targets on the team. I think that people talk about, who's going to be playing in the slot? Is it Kevin? Is it Amari? It's both. Both of them are going to play in the slot. Both of them are going to play out wide. One thing that Braum and his brother Brian Braum and the whole offensive staff does very well, that we saw at Western Kentucky, we saw at Purdue, and we're going to see here at Louisville, is switching it up, showing different ways to get different guys the ball. End arounds, wide receiver screens, slants over the middle, deep balls. There's going to be a lot of differentiating styles that we're going to see these 3 receivers sort of intertwine in playing. I think that all 3 are very, very good at creating separation and being able to, create missed tackles and get to the end zone from far distances. I think that Kevin Coleman Jr., in my opinion, is the most explosive receiver on the team. Honestly, like a 1A, 1B, because I think Amari is right there too. And people will talk about, well, Amari saw a step back in production last year. Well, you have to look at the context. The passing offense wasn't necessarily the greatest. Malik Cunningham got hurt midway through the season, and the passing offense struggled. Now, the passing offense was never absolutely phenomenal under Scott Satterfield anyway. So, I mean, you can sort of, micro analyze this situation, but the harsh truth is, I think that the offense in the past couple seasons didn't necessarily do a lot of favors for Amari Huggins-Bruce in terms of scheme. So I think those 3 players are going to be the 3 that get the most targets. Now, who backs them up? I think that arguably you could say Chris Bell, Jadon Thompson, and Jimmy Calloway. Those are the 3 that I want to know, of those 3, which of them stand out the most. And I think that all 3 have a very compelling case for their respective, for themselves, respectively, I should say. I think Chris Bell, now I've said this time and time again, I think it's going to be almost impossible for Chris Bell to not see the field. I was told from someone that had been around off-season workouts, had been around spring practice and fall camp, that Chris Bell looked like one of the best wide receivers on the team. He offers that different type of receiver, being a larger receiver, over 6 foot tall, over 6'2", over 225 pounds. There's a reason that Mississippi State tried so desperately to keep him in state. I think that he is a player that, whether it be at tight end in certain situations, whether it be out wide, Jeff Braum and company are going to find it tough to keep him off the field. I personally think that, honestly, he might be one of the most talented guys in this room. Jimmy Calloway, Jadon Thompson have both had some pretty solid moments this spring and offseason. I was told that at times Jimmy Calloway looked like the best receiver for this unit. Now, granted, you can never get too high, never get too low when it comes to offseason takeaways, because you're not playing in pads. You're playing against your teammates. There's just not a lot of opportunity to make very concrete observations with players because of the circumstances within the workouts. But there's been a lot of praise for Jimmy Calloway. He was a player that had to play behind Cedric Tillman, had to play behind Jalen Hyatt. And due to some issues at Tennessee last year, didn't see a lot of time on the field, but he has that talent. Jadon Thompson, a player that also from the Power 5 from Cincinnati, was a top 4 receiver last year for the Bearcats. I think that he's another guy that people are overlooking in this group that I think that the main thing I'm focused on here, I think that we know our starters, or we know the players that are going to get the most targets, in my opinion. That's Jamari Thrash, Kevin Coleman Jr., and Amari Huggins-Bruce. The thing we have to figure out after this is who's backing those guys up, who's going to separate themselves to be a secondary option for Jack Plummer and this Louisville offense. And I think it all comes down to those three, and who knows, maybe Jaleel McClain, maybe Hicks, maybe Fowles, maybe one of the walk-ons are able to get some opportunities to find themselves in situations to where they're making big-time plays. So wide receiver is the number one position that I'm looking at and wondering, okay, how's this going to shake out for the University of Louisville? So we'll obviously be able to tell some sort of an answer on Friday evening. I do now want to go to the defensive side of the ball. One position to where I have no idea who is going to start is the linebacker position. We'll talk about whether or not Ron English and Mark Hagan decide to go with experience, decide to go with overall talent, etc. here momentarily after we talk about our friends and the title sponsor of the show, LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. Create your job post onto your profile with the purple hashtag hiring frame to your profile to spread the word that you're hiring. You get simple tools at your disposal like screening questions that make it easy to focus on the candidates with just the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you would like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality, because it is pivotal to add the right team member to your team to have a positive and measurable impact on your business. LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Heading into the second segment of this position battle episode of the show, we are talking about the most notable position battles heading into the last week of the offseason. Just talked about wide receivers. I now want to talk about the linebacker position. This is a very interesting one because we sort of have an idea with the wide receiver position of who's going to play a lot and who's going to start. At the linebacker position, I don't think anybody has a clue as to what this defense is going to run out there on Friday evening. There are a handful of worthy candidates. I think that not only do you have inexperience, it's not due to inexperience that there is uncertainty with this group. I think that there are some very worthy candidates on this team to be able to replace Monty Montgomery and Momo Sanogo and Dorian Jones. Now, granted, you aren't going to play as many linebackers this year because of the scheme change. You're in a 4-2-5 rather than a 3-4. So at the star position, you're going to have guys like Ben Perry and Gilbert Frierson. At the Leo will be Stephen Heron, Popeye Williams, Cam Wilson, etc. So middle inside linebackers, you're probably only going to see, 2, maybe 3 at a time, depending on certain packages. Looking at who's going to start. Now, I think one of the starters for me is going to be TJ Quinn. He was the most impressive player in the spring game. The 6'1", 230-pound redshirt sophomore safety converted into a linebacker has continued to work on his frame, but I think his ability to defend the run, but also coupling that with his ability to read offenses and coverage abilities put him into a breakout candidacy for the Louisville Cardinals this fall. I think that Quinn is going to be the player that is probably going to be the starter at one of the linebacker spots for the Cardinals, because I do think that he's a guy that had probably the most impressive spring. And that's no disrespect to any of these other players, but at the end of the day, I think that Quinn is the guy that, hey, look, he's probably the player that ends up in this situation of starting at one of the inside linebacker positions. The other one gets a little bit tricky. I honestly think this could be a X or Y type of depth chart decision, to where it's player or player, to where it's one or the other. So, you have Keith Brown, who just transferred in from Oregon and joined the program in the summer. Jalen Alderman, the 6'1 junior that stepped in for Monty Montgomery when he got hurt in 2021, had the memorable pick 6 in that game against Central Florida early in that season. But I do think that he is a player that could be right there as well. You have Jackson Hamilton, redshirt sophomore from that 2021 class that has had some big-time moments. You also have some walk-on guys that are projecting to have some sort of rotational roles for this team. Darian Bell is a player that I look at that could be a player that sees some time this upcoming season. You have Jack Rieger as well. Both had under 5 tackles to their 2022 campaigns respectively, but I do think that there is going to be opportunity for them. But TJ Quinn, one starter for me. The other one, I think it's going to be an or situation. I'm going to go or situation. I think it's going to be Keith Brown or Jalen Alderman. I think that both of those players are veteran guys that have been waiting their turns in the wings. Keith Brown was a player that was going to have a pretty decent role for Oregon this year, possible starter for Dan Lanning's team up in Eugene. Jalen Alderman, 3rd year with the program, 3rd year in college football. I do think that this is a bounce-back year for him, sort of like TJ Quinn, safety, transitioned over into linebacker, continuing to add to his frame. He's listed as 6'1", 230, just like TJ Quinn. So I think that getting that frame to where it needed to be and being able to keep that speed that comes with it, he's been another guy that has impressed in the offseason. So I think that you're looking at TJ Quinn and one of Keith Brown or Jalen Alderman for the starters. But make no mistake about it, this coaching staff has said it. Or there has been multiple people around the program that have said it. It's going to be very, very tough to keep Stanquan Clark off the field. He's been a guy that has learned very, very nicely over the spring semester last year. Him being an early enrollee did wonders for his ability to get acclimated with this group, get acclimated with the scheme and the playbook. He has been making plays all offseason over the past couple months. He, in my opinion, has the highest ceiling of any of the linebackers on the team. That's just how good he is. Now, granted, it's tough to learn that position, inside linebacker, but Stanquan Clark could end up being one of the exceptions across college football. He's been a guy that multiple analysts have tabbed as a freshman in the ACC to make some noise, and I fully expect him to do so. But week 1, I don't necessarily know that he's going to start. I know that he's going to play. He's going to play, a pretty notable amount. But I think that it's going to take some time, and I think that we're really going to see him start to find his stride in that Murray State game, in the Indiana game, when he has a couple of games under his belt. But I'm looking for Stanquan Clark to play a good amount. And then you have guys like Jackson Hamilton, who you can't overlook as well. He was also a part of that 2021 class that I expect to have a solid season. You have a lot of inexperience in the group, but I think that the talent is there. And this is the true epitome of next man up situation, because you have a group that is extremely inexperienced as a whole, but you have a ton of talent and the potential is there. It's a matter of putting that on the field. People will ask about TJ Capers. I think that year 1, it's hard to really expect what we're going to see from him, especially since he was a reclassification. He was a player that was added to the team late in the offseason, and I don't expect him to start right away year one, or at least early on in the year. I think he's going to play a good amount of special teams, situational third down pass rusher. But as it relates to being an inside linebacker, well, that's yet to be seen. And with the linebacking position, we're talking about more so the inside linebacker at this point. So a lot of inexperience within the group, but still a ton of talent. Speaking of inexperience within the group, but a ton of talent, we're going to now look at the tight end position. Still up in the air on who is going to be the starter. Josh Lifson is probably the projected starter, but not set in stone, and there is a pretty substantial position battle after him. We'll talk about that position in the third segment after I tell you what's going to happen for content for the rest of the week. First of all, thanks again for making Locked On Louisville your first listen of the day. Just a reminder that the show is free on all streaming services, 5 days a week, your team every day. Now, content for the rest of the week. I'm going to Atlanta for this game. I will be leaving on Thursday. There will be an episode Thursday morning. There won't be one on Friday, and I will be staying until Monday. So there might be an episode Monday evening. If not, there will be one on Tuesday. But we will talk about players to watch. We will talk about X factors, keys to the game, predictions, what's at stake for this game, so on and so forth. So be sure to stay tuned. But heading into the last segment of the show, discussing the third position battle that I am interested in seeing how it turns out, is the tight end position. We talked about how there's a ton of inexperience at this group, not only from a positional standpoint of guys on the team, but also some of these guys haven't been playing tight end for long. Take Joey Gatewood, for example. Quarterback turned wide receiver, now turned tight end. I think that ultimately Josh Lifson is going to be the starter at tight end right away for the Cardinals. Had a solid spring, showed that camaraderie and chemistry with quarterback Jack Plummer in the offseason. It's probably one of the thinnest positions on the team at this point in time. There's not a ton of experience. I think that Lifson is going to be the player that at least starts out right away because of that overall, just the overall time in the collegiate system, I should say. More time than Jamari Johnson, who I think is right behind him. But Lifson showed some solid moments in the offseason. I think he's going to be the starting tight end. Now, granted, tight ends are used very uniquely in the Brom offense. There's opportunity for multiple tight end sets. I think that is where we're going to see guys like Jamari Johnson, also Nate Kariski, and Joey Gatewood get involved for the Louisville Cardinals here. With Lifson being the starter, Jamari Johnson has been able to transform his body throughout the offseason, getting to a solid playing level. He has the physical ready body to play in college, which is huge for Louisville. But, not to mention has to learn to block at a high level, which he wasn't really being tasked with last year at high school. But that athleticism, that pass catching ability, that rare blend of speed and size and verticality and athleticism is really going to bode well to his advantage, to where we could see a situation where he's starting by the end of the season. And that's something that we just have to focus on, is although that Lifson might be the starter right away, you have guys like Jamari Johnson who could take that spot at the end of the year, or at the very least, both of them are on the field at the same time. You're seeing Johnson in more of a pass catching situation. You also have that situation for Joey Gatewood, who hasn't really had much experience as a receiver, where he was last year for Central Florida, but transfers to Louisville, the former UK quarterback, and the staff has raved about his athleticism in the offseason. He has made some big-time plays throughout the spring, throughout the summer, to where there is the expectation that he's going to at least play some role. Potentially, it's like a Trey Burton role, where we see him maybe in wildcat situations on the goal line, being a pass catcher with his size on the goal line. So that is another player to watch out for. And then you have Nate Kariski, who was a sort of an underrated guy coming out of high school, 6'3", 225 pounds, out of the DC area in that 2022 class. He's a player that I think really could be playing a solid role for Louisville blocking for the offense. He is going to potentially be on the outside looking in because of the talent at pass catcher. But Grant Mulligan, good friend of the show, football analyst for the stateoflouisville.com, said that Kariski is one of his X factors for the season because he's not getting talked about enough when we talk about tight ends. So he's another player. And like I said, Chris Bell, another guy that there might be too big of a log jam at receiver to where we see him as a pass catcher at tight end in certain situations, potentially in multiple tight end sets where Lifson or Johnson is blocking, and then you have Bell potentially playing like a Marshawn Ford role. So something to focus on. But those are the three key position battles that I'm looking forward to seeing how they turn out in that first game against Georgia Tech and through the first part of the season. That's going to wrap up today's episode of the show. To find the show on all platforms, be sure to stay tuned to this graphic. Have a great day. We'll see you right back here really soon.